We start?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, so welcome everybody. We are extremely glad to have you today. Welcome to this new cycle of webinars devoted to contemporary issues in Eurasia. So today is the very first session. We have 5 other sessions that will be following. This event is hosted by IRSEM and co-organized by INALCO. So today we'll be dealing with border issues in the Arctic, and we have our two speakers here today. And following this session, we'll have 5 other sessions. So the next one is going to be on South Caucasus and the dynamics after the ceasefire agreement in Nagorno-Karabakh. After that, we'll have a session on the border between Moldova and Ukraine. And then we'll move to Central Asia with a session devoted to the border between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. And then we'll go all the way to the Russian margins in the Far East. And we'll deal with the Russian-Chinese border and then the Russian-North Korean border. But today we'll focus on the Arctic, and I'll give the floor to Emmanuel.
Mm-hmm.
But before that, we would like to mention that the questions should be dropped in the Q&A box that you'll find right down below on your screen. Please send your questions there. We'll collect them and ask them on your behalf. And Emmanuel and I will facilitate the process.
Yeah, thank you, Mélanie. I see we have people from various places in Europe and in the US. So good evening or good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for being here with us. Today, we are happy to have 2 distinguished speakers, Katarina Kertysova and Mathieu Boulègue. Katarina, I'm glad to see you again, even on Zoom. We met last year in Washington, D.C. in person, as we were both fellows at the Wilson Center Kennan Institute. It was a tremendous experience. And you're now a policy fellow at the European Leadership Network in London. Your current work focuses on conventional arms control, Russia-West relations, Arctic security and climate nuclear nexus. And you co-authored last June together with Sherry Goodman an in-depth study about the nuclearization of the Russian Arctic. Cher Mathieu, thank you for being here. We've known each other for many years now, and you're a research fellow in London at the Chatham House, where you conduct research on Eurasian security and defense issues, as well as on Russia domestic and foreign policy, a very timely topic, if I may. And I mentioned here an impressive research paper you published in May 2019 about Russian military posture in the Arctic, which actually leads me to today's presentation. We'll start with Katarina, then Mathieu will speak, and then we'll have a Q&A session. So just a kind reminder for the Q&A, please make sure to send your question in the Q&A chat in French or in English. And if you want, you can also briefly introduce yourself. We will collect them and ask them directly to the speakers. We'll also mute everybody so that we can only hear the speakers. Katarina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation. It's very good to be here and to see some familiar faces. Today's presentation is about the Arctic and the border questions in the Arctic. In recent years, the Arctic has been attracting a lion's share of attention from the global community. So we've seen that the region that has been called the world's last frontier has become the world's first frontier. It's the fastest warming place, which presents both immense economic opportunities as well as environmental and security challenges. And it is also the most peaceful place in the world. It still is, but this exceptionalism is coming under threat. So my presentation will start with addressing some of the border questions and definitions of the Arctic. Then I will move on to the concept of Arctic exceptionalism and the ongoing cooperation, and then to the reasons why this cooperation is coming under stress. Next slide, please. So let us start with trying to define what the Arctic is. So there's no universally defined and accepted boundary of the Arctic region, even among the Arctic states themselves. Who belongs to the Arctic, what counts as Arctic, and who is an Arctic stakeholder are all contested questions. Now, today, there are different maps and ways to define how far this region spans. And this boundary changes depending on the function. So whether it applies to environmental, biological, economic, or social issues. Most scientists define the Arctic as the area within the Arctic Circle. So everything above 66 degrees north of the equator. From a climatic perspective, the common definition includes lands and islands to the north of the northern limits of the forest. So everything above the tree line demarcation. Another closely related way of defining the Arctic is the 10 degrees Celsius average summer temperature. Membership in the Arctic Council today is limited to those 8 countries whose territories extend beyond the Arctic Circle. And by coincidence, these 8 countries are also the only 8 states whose territories also extend beyond the 10-degree line. Next slide, please. Today's discussion will revolve primarily around the concept of the High North. So the High North is sometimes used synonymously with the Arctic, but they're not the same. The terms overlap. By the High North is a term that came to the English language relatively recently from Norwegian to describe the northern areas. So this definition contains both geographic as well as political elements. So in geographic terms, the High North stretches northwards from the Nordland County in Norway and eastwards from the Greenland Sea to the Barents and the Petchora Seas. And in political terms, it includes the administrative entities of Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia that are part of the Barents Cooperation, so the area in gray. Next slide, please. Excuse me, 1 second. So one of the cliches about the Arctic is that it is a lawless frontier without any legal framework or an ocean to be governed. And it is true that currently there's no comprehensive legal regime that would be comparable to the Antarctic treaty system. However, over the past 30 years, the Arctic has experienced a remarkable growth in formal and informal international institutions and arrangements. And through these arrangements, both states and non-state actors work together and manage areas of friction. The Arctic Council, which was created in 1996, is at the heart of the current governance regime. And it's sometimes even referred to as the shadow Arctic government. And it brings together 8 Arctic states, indigenous peoples organizations, and a total of 39 observer states and organizations. Another key element of the Arctic governance regime is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, which is in force since 1994. And it governs issues such as delineation of the outer limits of the continental shelf, the protection of the marine environment, freedom of navigation, or marine scientific research. And as you can see from this visual, the United States, for example, is not signatory to the UNCLOS, but it still abides by the treaty as a customary law. So just to summarize, so the Arctic regime is not a single comprehensive and integrated structure, but a mosaic of measures and arrangements at local, sub-regional, and regional levels. Next slide, please. And because today's seminar and the seminar cycle is dedicated to border issues in Eurasia, I wanted to touch upon boundary making in the Arctic. And boundary making on land is not the same as boundary making at sea. Maritime boundaries only delineate sovereign rights of a given state within that maritime domain. And this, in turn, enables states to exploit resources in the water and on the seabed and regulate related environmental issues. So In contrast to borders on land, states that are entitled to certain maritime spaces can't deny passage through these zones. They can only deny access to marine resources and apply environmental regulations in those maritime borders. Settling maritime borders is a positive sum process and provides positive sum outcomes. So it's a win-win situation for all stakeholders involved, because once maritime borders are settled, states are able to engage in resource development, joint extraction activities. They're also able to better manage fishing rights and quotas and better respond if a crisis occurs. Next slide, please. Most of the maritime boundaries in the Arctic have been resolved. Today, only a few overlapping claims remain. So apart from maritime zonal disputes and continental shelf extension, there's only one territorial dispute, so dispute over land in the Arctic, and that concerns Hans Island. However, it is not considered a contentious issue. And the fact that there are still several unresolved boundary issues begs the question, how likely is conflict over resources or territorial claims in the Arctic? Next slide, please. And so the answer is very low. First, resource wars are unlikely because the majority of resources, such as oil and gas, minerals, or fish stocks, are already within maritime zones and territories of Arctic states. So, you know, the winners of the so-called resource race are already determined to a large extent. And although there have been alarmist claims about territorial grabs, states have a tendency to abide by the rules that are set forth by the UNCLOS. So diplomacy negotiations continue to prevail when states try to resolve these boundary issues. And in fact, resolving these disputes have even been collaborative. So states have collaborated in scientific exploration before submitting their claims to the UNCLOS. Between 2006 and 2012, 4 agreements or tentative agreements were signed. And the most notable one was the historic agreement between Russia and Norway in 2010, which ended almost 40 years of a border dispute in the Barents Sea. Next slide, please. And this brings me to the next part of my presentation, and that is the fact that Arctic is an exceptional zone of cooperation. For a very long time, the Arctic states have had a tendency to compartmentalize their policies, which means that they would set aside some of the geopolitical differences that they experience in other regions for the sake of common interests. And we have seen that despite friction over Syria, Ukraine, and even Russian interference in the 2016 US presidential elections, among many other issues, Russia and the US have continued to cooperate on matters pertaining to the Arctic region. And to prove that, since 2011, 5 binding agreements were signed in the Arctic, and really no other region has experienced that amount of cooperation. The 5 agreements are listed here. The first 3 were negotiated within the framework of the Arctic Council. And only 2 weeks ago, the United States and Russia signed a joint contingency plan for pollution response in the Bering and the Chukchi Seas. So this cooperation continues. Next slide, please. In recent years, however, we have seen that this Arctic exceptionalism has really come under threat. And there are 4 specific developments that are putting successful Arctic cooperation to date at risk. The first one is the US climate disengagement under Trump administration. For a very long time, the United States played a leading role in addressing climate issues, both globally and in the Arctic. Under President Trump, however, the United States withdrew from the Paris Agreement and even rolled back on many domestic measures that were designed to limit fossil fuel development in the United States. President Trump did not believe that climate change was man-made, and Trump administration on several occasions even blocked international efforts to combat climate change. And this has really impacted the US relations with other Arctic states. The 2019 Arctic Council ministerial meeting in Rovaniemi in Finland is a very good example of that, because it did not end well, and most people would blame the United States for this. So because the United States was unwilling to accept any language on climate change, the ministers could not even reach an agreement laying out the mandate for the Icelandic chairmanship. And it was in fact the very first Arctic Council ministerial that ended without a joint declaration. The second strain on this cooperative Arctic environment is the re-emergence of great power politics and narratives, coupled with increasing military activities in the Arctic. Since 2009, the United States under President Trump started to pursue more overt zero-sum approach to its Arctic diplomacy. And we have seen the narrative of great power competition coming to the fore, which has really undermined the cooperative spirit that the Arctic Council represents. And the speech by the former US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, in Rovaniemi, where he referred to the Arctic as an arena for power and competition, fed directly into this great power narrative. And in recent years, we've seen that Russia has increased its military presence and activities, what got other Arctic states worried. And Russia claims it is in its own right and that its military buildup is defensive in nature. But in response, we have seen that the United States and NATO allies started increasing their own military presence and activities. And at the moment, the European Arctic, or the High North, is experiencing most military activity in the region. Third, there's the China factor. So for more than a decade, China has been trying to define itself as an Arctic regional player and a near Arctic state, and it really wishes to play a more visible role in regional policymaking. So on the one hand, we've had a deepening of Sino-Russian commercial ties, while at the same time, there has been a stronger resistance to Chinese activity in the Arctic, especially from the United States, which has been increasingly critical of China's presence and in the Arctic, and even trying to leverage China out of the region. And I think that Greenland is a good example of this Sino-American competition for Arctic influence, because Chinese firms are joint investors in potential mining projects in Greenland, and Beijing has shown interest in the development of infrastructure on the island. But these have generated a backlash from both Denmark and the United States, and the Trump's interests or statements that he might be interested in potentially buying Greenland a few years back should be understood in this context. But the China factor is only characteristic of a larger phenomenon that's taking place in the Arctic, and that is internationalization of Arctic affairs. So with the opening up of the sea routes and previously inaccessible resources, many countries outside of the region are looking at the Arctic as important to their trade, to their scientific interests, and eventually security. So no one wants to miss out. And there are more and more Arctic countries, including across Europe, that are designing their Arctic strategy, want to be accepted as Arctic stakeholders, and even participate in future governance initiative. And when we look at the current structure of the Arctic Council, it was designed in a way that there can't be an inclusion of new members. So if we look 10 or 20 years into the future, where there's new potential economic activity in the Arctic that has been underwritten by East Asia or other parts of Europe, will the structure of the Arctic Council or the current governance be able to stand up to that? So can new forms of regional cooperation that are more global in scope be created? So we need to make sure and we need to ensure that there is this balance between Arctic and non-Arctic stakeholders and manage those interactions. But how exactly the future Arctic security environment will look depends primarily on the US-Russian relations in other regions around the world. And I think that the future is promising, firstly, because we have a US administration that made climate change part of its campaign, and that has re-engaged the United States with the global climate regime. And although it's too early to say what the exact Arctic engagement will be, we can expect that there will be more Arctic cooperation than under the previous administration. And also in May, Russia will assume the rotating chairmanship of the Arctic Council. And Russia really likes Arctic Council as a venue, and it will likely use it to demonstrate that it is a constructive player. So I think that the future outlooks are positive, but we have to watch out for the irritants. Thank you very much. I'll leave it at that, and we can return to some of these points in more detail later.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katarina.
So much.
Thank you.
Mathieu,
we'll leave the floor to Mathieu.
Yeah,
sure. Yeah, if you could jump up the PowerPoint, that'd be great. But thank you very much for having me. I'm going to be sort of latching on to Katarina's excellent presentation and do a lot of overlaps. So don't mind the repetition. What I want to talk about is mostly having a look at sort of a deeper dive into the conflict triggers and conflict potential, as I call them, the flashpoints, potential conflict and tension in the Arctic, looking at what is the role of NATO in the ecosystem as well. How much do we need a hard military security infrastructure for the Arctic, but also a few policy recommendations concerning ways forward in moving in that direction. So as Katarina introduced her presentation, I will basically say the same. The Arctic is and is still understood as an area of low tension. I mean, we're far away still from the Cold War competition that the region saw during the Cold War. The problem is that this sort of low tension and exceptionalism is increasingly hard to isolate from wider geopolitical tension. And this for two reasons. The first one is basic increased human activity, right? Under the effect of climate change, you have more people, more tourists, more drilling, more cargo, more transit, which means that more people means more potential environmental damage, more catastrophes happening, and also more activity that needs regulating. The second reason is increased military activity. Katarina already mentioned it. There is a growing pattern of tit for tat, escalation, de-escalation that is feeding a security dilemma between Russia on the one hand and the rest of the Arctic coastal states on the other, led by US and NATO increasingly these days. Recent endeavors in Russia have been quite telling. There is now a new fully fledged, full-on military district only attributed to the Arctic zone, which is unprecedented in Russian military structure. In the US, there has been a sort of renewal. The interest on the Arctic is very cyclical. It's at an all-time high at the moment. This will go down the agenda, but right now they're surfing the wave of Arctic policy. There's been a flurry of memorandum and documents under the Trump administration. Let's see if they stick under Biden, but at least there is an interest. NATO as an alliance has been waking up to the Arctic as a zone of interest beyond just the North Atlantic, but really about the Arctic itself. We can look at the cold response military exercises, for instance, or the now quite famous Trident Juncture 2018, where Russia has been fiddling with during the exercise. What is key to all these actors, whether it's Russia or other coastal states, is basically increasing maritime domain awareness and ensuring freedom of navigation, whatever it is. It's a question of borders and how you interpret what does freedom of navigation means and what increased maritime domain awareness means in a changing Arctic. Next slide, please. If we look at the different flashpoints of potential violence and potential conflict in the Arctic, I will not mention Svalbard because I don't think there's major cause for concern, but I think we'll be happy to take questions on Svalbard specifically if there are any. The first set of issues I want to raise is what I call soft security issues. Basically, the maybe unwarranted fear, but can I have the next slide if possible? Thank you. The maybe unwarranted fear in Russia that the US and other players could be trying to change Russia's understanding of the Northern Sea routes and the way they're exploiting UNCLOS, the law of the sea, at their advantage when it comes to extending their control and their sovereignty over the exclusive economic zone along the Northern Sea route. Russia is seeing NATO military activities in adjacent waters to the Northern Sea route. They are scared of US positioning of ballistic missile defense in the region, for instance, or increased subsurface presence and the potential arrival of surface presence close to the NSR, which means that Russia is very much unhappy with the situation and over-securitizes the whole lot. Emmanuel, could I get the next slide, please? And could you put it into diaporama mode? Thank you. The second soft security issue that Katarina touched upon already is China. China is not just a near Arctic state, as it called itself, which, if you ask me, is a complete fallacy. If we leave the door open to near Arctic states, then we make the whole architecture of coastal, non-coastal completely crumble. And China has been increasing its footprint when it comes to normative changes in the Arctic. Marc Lantain refers to it as China from being a norm entrepreneur to being a norm maker in the Arctic, with using a sort of revisionist position to Arctic governance and slowly using preemptive legal warfare, for instance, in transforming the region into a global commons, which goes contrary to this logic of national interest for Russia, for Canada, for Norway, and other players in the Arctic. Russia is once again not very happy about China's role in the Arctic, especially when it comes to changing the governance facts on the ground. I could still use that PowerPoint if you can screen it. Concerning Russia and China, for now, Russia tolerates China's presence, not least because they need it for energy exports along the Northern Sea route, but also because they very much need China to prove the point that Russia is not an isolated player in the Arctic. For now, China is being allowed as an observer to the Arctic Council by Russia, but this is also conditional to compliant behavior. So Russia is very much aware of the issue. When it comes to hard security, a few points I want to make in terms of conflict potential and triggers. The first one is, of course, Russian behavior in the Arctic. And Russia has been increasing its military footprints, increasing its force posture, and its brinkmanship-prone activities in the high north. Russia has a more brazen approach to demonstrating presence and reaching beyond just the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation and far into the North Atlantic. Thank you very much. That's perfect. Russia has been conducting a lot of military activities, some of which are entirely unacceptable military behavior at peacetime. For instance, simulated airstrike formations against Norwegian military assets in Vardø, or GPS jamming operations in northern Finland and Finnmark during Trident Juncture 2018, or the announcement of SNAP military exercises and missile exercises in the basin of the Norwegian Sea, all of which go way beyond what is acceptable at peacetime, especially when it is during a military exercise of NATO, and especially because this could potentially endanger civilian lives. So when you jam a whole area of operation, you could endanger search and rescue, for instance, which makes the Arctic even more unpredictable in that logic. Another issue is the fear of horizontal escalation from one theater of operation to another, where tension from the Baltic Sea, for instance, could degenerate into the Arctic. And that is also something to watch for. The problem is that for now, Russia has been largely defining the rules of the road of military activities in the Arctic, which means that there's a lot of counter signaling to be done to show that Russia cannot be led to believe that it owns the Arctic in terms of military signaling. Nor can we allow the Kremlin to believe that it can operate completely free in a potentially contested environment, or limit freedom of navigation to allied operations or national operations. The second hard security issue is increased tension around the now infamous GI-UK and GI-N gaps, which is also owed to Russia's sea denial strategy and extending the bastion defense perimeter from the Kola Peninsula closer to the North Atlantic now, which is putting a lot of pressure. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Which is putting a lot of pressure directly into the North Atlantic. and directly into the sea line of communication in the North Atlantic. This is also in turn increasing the risk of miscalculation and tactical errors, which means that these parts of the sea, especially Norwegian Sea, could be prone to more accidents and incidents as well in terms of military behavior, which require more regulation. The last part is what I call the phone-up vicious circle, which is something that we can all see coming, but we don't want to address as a gray rhino yet, which is that we have right now a predictable pattern of tit-for-tat, action-reaction behavior, dangerously emerging around the North Atlantic and around the Bube Gap, concerning freedom of operation, freedom of navigation operations, for instance, and increased military activity in this region. In May 2020, the US and UK navies conducted a large-scale phone-up in the Barents Sea, which Russia understood as vindication that yes, they need to increase their military posture in the region, which could lead to further escalation down the road. What we have is a textbook developing an already full-blown security dilemma, once again, between Russia and the US and NATO in terms of increased military presence, and this action-reaction dynamic that needs to be addressed urgently before we sleepwalk into crossing each other's red lines. Next slide, please. So looking more closely at hard security issues in the Arctic, then I'm going to talk about the consequences of mismanaging this low tension that we talked about already, and mismanaging the sort of end to Arctic exceptionalism and the next phase of what the Arctic will look like. The problem now is that Russia is increasing this gap in terms of Arctic operations and capabilities, which means that we can only be playing catch up when it comes to the efforts. But playing catch up is not only the only thing to do, right? It's not because you have icebreakers, contrary to Trump's policy, that you'll be able to deploy them sufficiently. So bridging the icebreaker gap, for instance, is one thing, but is not the key to everything in this ecosystem. It's also about trying to diminish the cost of entry for potential operations and ensuring freedom of navigation and ensuring operational freedom when it comes to entering contested environments. This doesn't mean that there's an A280 bubble in the Arctic, because I can see it coming in the questions. This doesn't mean that we have a SLOC interdiction problem in the sea line of communication. It means we need to be more careful when it comes to calculating the cost of entry in an environment that is increasingly problematic. NATO's role is pretty much right now about determining how much NATO we want in the ecosystem, bearing in mind that it is crucial to differentiate the endeavor of the alliance in itself and the contributions of individual nations to Arctic security. And it's really important to make the difference. NATO might not be the best place to discuss military security affairs in the Arctic, especially with Russia at the level of the NATO-Russia Council, because if you place NATO somewhere, you basically militarize it, according to the Kremlin, which would make things even more complicated to uphold low tension. What I would argue for is that NATO needs a smart presence and adaptable readiness to operating in the Arctic. Basically having a sort of software change that is slowly coming inside the alliance, and sort of a new collective approach to the Arctic. The establishment of Joint Force Command Norfolk, for instance, is a very good way and a good step forward in a way to be discussing the sort of changing software understanding or changing collective approach to the Arctic. And it will be interesting to look at the results. The other thing is don't overreach. It's not necessary to keep the Arctic too high on the agenda for NATO. We don't have to overdo it, because this will make Russia very uncomfortable and in time, feed this security dilemma that we are out there to get Russia. The next point I wanted to make concerns hard security architecture in the Arctic. Considering all of the above and what Katarina said, I believe it's time to open a more inclusive debate and set up a regulatory framework around military security in the Arctic. The signs are on the wall. We need to talk about hard security. It's just a question of finding the right format and finding what we need to discuss. And we also need to find a balance between too much security discussions, which will completely suck the air out of everything, and a security void. This is an expression used by Arctic researcher Abby Tingstad from RAND, which I find is very interesting, that we should have also avoid a complete absence of discussions around security issues. So what I would argue is that we need two things. The first thing is a dedicated military security mechanism, or at least a consultation format in the Arctic that would help us with the discussions. And the second thing is a tailored military code of conduct for the Arctic, which is basically determining the military rules of the road in the region. In terms of this mechanism or this consultation format, it doesn't have to be over-institutionalized. It doesn't have to be over-politicized. It just needs to be flexible enough that it is engaging for countries who can deploy and sustain military force in the Arctic. It's not a question of coastal states. It's not a question of Arctic Plus or Arctic 8 or near Arctic states. It's a question of who can deploy and sustain military force in the region at the moment. France would be a party to it, for instance, as a country able to deploy there. The level of ambition is basically low-level military dialogue. I'm not talking about huge military cooperation. I'm just talking about a level of military dialogue. At the same time, if we can't create a new framework, then we need to empower existing endeavors, such as the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable or the Arctic Chiefs of Defense Staff meetings, for instance. The problem is that Russia has been excluded or excluded itself from this framework, which means that we need to do something about it, but I'll come back to it a bit later. The second point is a military code of conduct. It's already been discussed. Some research at CSIS have been championing this idea as well, concerning a military code of conduct or sort of military rules of the road that would give a sort of functional framework to regulate military activity and determine what is considered legitimate, acceptable, unacceptable, and illegitimate in terms of military practice at peacetime. I'm not talking about war, right? I'm talking about peacetime. That would help increase transparency, predictability, and accountability in the Arctic. Next slide, please. In terms of policy recommendation, very quickly, one thing to do is basically deconflict, increase transparency, and increase predictability. I touched upon it just before. In order to create, and before we create this aforementioned infrastructure, architecture to military security, there's a lot we can do in terms of reciprocal and mutual measures, in terms of, once again, low-level military to military contacts with states being able to deploy and sustain force in the Arctic. The second set of recommendation is don't overdo it. Once again, don't let hard security issues take the fore of the discussion. There is very little likelihood of conflict over the Arctic, and there is even less conflict in the Arctic itself at the moment. We just need to make sure we look very closely at the triggers for miscalculation and for accidents and spillover, specifically horizontal spillover from the North Atlantic and the Baltic Sea. Also, because security in the Arctic is not really Arctic specific. It is very much about an inclusive discussion around the wider geography, as we mentioned. And they cannot be only discussed as a pure Arctic framework. They need to engage the wider geopolitical discussions and the wider issues between states at the moment. Once again, we don't work in a vacuum in terms of political tension in the Arctic. We need to acknowledge it as well. Another reason not to overdo it is that there is a conflation between soft security and hard security. The Arctic is very much about one thing. It's safety, constabulary issues, human presence, search and rescue, and disaster mitigation, and all of the above in terms of soft security issues. We need to make sure this spirit of soft security cooperation is preserved and enhanced to keep low tension once again. Next slide, please. And another thing specifically designed for French policy, no, the one before, thank you. Stop the self-fulfilling prophecy of feeding this insecurity in the Arctic and this competitive narrative. It's not normal that a DGRIS document in 2019 says that the Arctic is like the Middle East. That's just not cool. Just as much as Pompeo's statement around we don't want the Arctic to turn into the new South China Sea is not cool at all. So please do not feed this geopolitical competition narrative. Do not feed this logic of arms race, and do not feed the fact that it's the Middle East. It's not. This is a wrong assumption, and this is leading to bad policy. The last part is engage Russia. And this is where I will put a lot of caveats. Next slide, please. Katarina mentioned it. Russia prepares to assume the chairmanship of the Arctic Council and the Arctic Coast Guards Forum from 2021 to 2023. They have not yet released the full agenda of what they're going to do, but it's going to look like pretty much like the continuation of the Finnish and Icelandic presidencies. Russia might want to address hard security issues as a parallel agenda, but definitely not inside the Arctic Council. Before we create anything new in terms of infrastructure, we might want to re-invite Russia back, or let Russia be allowed back in the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable or the Chief of Defense Staff meeting. This is where the caveat comes, and this is where we have a Russia problem, is that this should not be code for accepting Russia's intolerable behavior with regards to Crimea, with regards to unprofessional military activity, and with regards to previous engagements in Ukraine and otherwise. And this is where we also have a Russia problem, because the moment we accept Russia back in, they will use it against us as vindication that they are right. So we need to be extra careful when it comes to these things. There is also another urgent matter concerning Russia, is to tackle the lack of transparency that Russia has in its Arctic zone of the Russian Federation. Recent events, such as the Norilsk spill in May 2020, or the Nyenaska radiation incidents in August 2019 are affecting the whole Arctic, are placing indigenous and local populations in danger, and are also spreading out and spilling over to the rest of the Arctic as a zone. And these things should also be placed on the agenda for Russia's chairmanship to tackle this lack of transparency. So I will stop there and I will welcome your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
That's fascinating. We already have many questions, so we'll start with the first question. So I'm just gonna read it out loud. You guys can answer, either one of you or the two of you guys. How do you explain the quote unquote rush of Asian countries towards the Arctic and their will to be present and active so far from their national territories? Do you think it is a good thing, and how do neighboring countries of the Arctic are perceiving this Asian interest? Yep.
Maybe
I could start.
And maybe just because the second question is somewhat related, it's about how real is China's ambition to develop the Polar Silk Road component of its Belt and Road Initiative. So if you can elaborate a little bit on that point too.
Thank you very much. Two very good questions. And I'm happy to take the floor first, because I think it builds well on my comment about the internationalization of Arctic affairs. So I'm not sure if Marianne has a question concerning specific Asian countries, but what we see is that a few Asian countries are already observers in the Arctic Council, including South Korea, Singapore, China, obviously, and Japan. So there are some countries that have already been participating in meetings of the Arctic Council. And this rush can be explained in the same way as the overall internationalization of Arctic affairs. No one wants to miss out. That's the first thing, that there are opportunities that the Arctic presents that the countries want to benefit from. Secondly, many countries feel that the implications of what's happening in the Arctic will have impact on their economies, on the habitat, on everything else. So they feel they should have a say in policies. They should have they should eventually have a say in what's taking place in the Arctic. So I would just say that it's a general effort of becoming a member of this club. And what we need to figure out in the future, as I said, in 10 to 20 years, how do we make sure that the interests of the Arctic states and the non-Arctic states are aligned? How do we find a good balance, and even how do we develop maybe a different regional framework that could better respond to this internationalization of Arctic affairs? And concerning the question on China's Polar Silk Road, so I think we are beyond the ambition. My understanding is that some parts of this Polar Silk Road are already operational. So this is an overall interest, to have shipping routes that also comprise the Northern Sea Route. So I know that some parts of it are already operationalized, and I just want to stress that China today is really pursuing 3 policy courses in the Arctic, and it's really trying not to be perceived as a revisionist power, because it understands that it relies, and its activities in the Arctic to a large extent rely on China being accepted by the Arctic stakeholder. And so it has stayed away from challenging the existing rules. And in its Arctic paper, it has also made it clear that it's not seeking territorial or sovereignty claims. So I just think that China will not be a revisionist force, and that this is really in line with its economic interests, scientific interests, and having a say eventually in the policies.
If I can jump on that as well, on China, I'll take the Asian rush. It's a really good question in the meantime. I do believe China is here to revise the whole Arctic infrastructure. Sorry, Katarina, this is where I disagree. I think China is a potentially dangerous revisionist, normative and legal player in the Arctic, and they're here to stay. The first thing is that it is very much a polar strategy. It is as much about the Arctic as it is about Antarctic. And further down the road, this could also lead to potential normative changes concerning the Antarctic Treaty, as the impact of climate change completely alters the region. Right now, what China is doing is basically using or exploiting the Northern Sea routes, specifically for LNG export, which is about 20% of cargo from Russia to China. The rest of the 80% is Russia, inwards trading, and exploiting it along its terms. It's still very much under Russian administrative rule, but China has been trying to make it more China compliant when it comes to transit. Further down the road, and this is where the Polar Silk Road becomes really interesting, China is bidding for time. They are looking at passage through the central Arctic Ocean. This will take 40, 50 years, we don't know yet, but what can be sure is that China will be trying to push for passage through the central Arctic Ocean and will probably place assets on the ground through investment, through more presence in the region as the route becomes accessible. This might lead to this Asian rush, to come back to this excellent question. I can't see it coming, but there could be the thing that by give it 40, 50 years, China will have created a critical mass of countries that are near Arctic, all of them, but interesting in transit and cargo passage through the central Arctic Ocean, and through normative changes and legal warfare, we'll be able to push for a different kind of normative status for the Arctic in terms of passage through this international body of water. Why not through escorts, you name it. But this could be, the way of creating this sort of Asian rush for places like Singapore, like Vietnam, like the Philippines, you name it, countries with major shipping intentions that could use the central Arctic Ocean. If and only if the insurance premium is not too expensive, that is, because it's all about how much cargo costs, right? So this still needs to be calculated. China wants to make the Arctic a global commons. That I think is understood clearly enough between the lines of their polar strategy. And they've been present through investments pretty much throughout the region of the coastal Arctic states, but they've also been present in terms of physical presence, claiming ocean science, but really also conducting dual use intelligence surveys in Greenland, in Svalbard, and in Iceland, which means that before long, we will wake up to have a China problem in the region. But once again, it's all the gray rhinos we don't see, right?
Thank you. Katarina, do you want to answer, or should we move on to the next question?
We can move on. We can agree to this.
Okay, that's good. We have another question that is more about the military dimensions that are taking place in the Arctic. So we have a question about the role of the US in challenging Russia's military buildup, and more specifically, the expansion of their fleet of nuclear-powered icebreakers and submarines. And building on that question, we have another one. Somebody who is asking to touch upon Russian military operations, if any, in the Arctic.
That's another 20-minute presentation on Russia's presence. Do you want to start, Katarina? So on the US presence, good question, right? So the Arctic was never really there under Obama, and Trump discovered the region probably, well, I don't know why he discovered the region, but anyway, in 2020, in May 2020, the US published a memorandum of safeguarding US national interest in the Arctic, which is basically an acquisition paper and a procurement paper to say we need more stuff, right? It's the Trump approach of we need stuff. We need guns, and these guns were basically ordering a new fleet of nuclear-powered icebreakers and increasing overall US military activity, not just for constabulary measures, but for more hard power. It is a wrong approach because this is based on procurement. It's not because you have icebreakers that you can actually displace them in time to a theater of operation and make them useful for anything. It's not like there's going to be a carrier group floating around the Norwegian Sea, for instance, anytime soon. What would be a good approach and a good policy is to actually take stock of existing endeavors with NATO and with other coastal states and look at the gaps. Anti-submarine warfare for one, counter mining operations is another one. Listening outposts would be another one, and more intel gathering and maritime domain awareness overall, more Air Force presence, you name it. So the reopening of the Keflavik facilities by the Marines and the US Air Force, for instance, very recently was a good step forward in that direction, but it should not be overshadowed by this sort of icebreaker gap that needs filling. It's not because you have nice toys that can actually float them anywhere. So I hope that the Biden administration will see through the Trump cracks and improve a policy that is actually a bit more reasonable than just buying stuff for the sake of it. Concerning Russia's military presence, sure, I'd be happy to touch upon it, but once again, that would probably be another 20-minute conversation. Is there a specific question on this, Emmanuel? Or?
It was about Russian military operations, so maybe I will rephrase a little bit, and maybe the question was more about Russian military presence in the Arctic. So some details, maybe if you have some views on the creation of the Arctic Brigade, for instance.
Yeah, sure. So very quickly, so basically Russia completely let the Arctic to rot in the 90s and rediscovered the potential of the Arctic as a resource base, as a human development and infrastructure base, and as a passage base through the Northern Sea route in the early to mid 2000s. Since then, we've seen a very clear pattern of what Russia does best, which is I have a new region and a new frontier. I need to militarize and securitize the hell out of it. Which means that we've seen this pattern of emerging creation of a threat coming from other actors, creation of the need to enforce new borders as they understand it, and increase the presence in terms of sovereignty enforcement. This has been done through revamping the search and rescue infrastructure, for instance, the radar infrastructure along the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation, radar coverage, you name it. But this has also been done in a very Russian way through a clear remilitarization of the region. I'm not talking levels that we knew during the Cold War, but I'm talking about a sort of revamp of military infrastructure and military capabilities specifically tailored to the Arctic. This for the reason of, once again, sovereignty enforcement, but also if we look very closely at the European Arctic to ensure a perimeter defense around the bastion on the Kola Peninsula. Kola Peninsula hosts about 2/3 of the sea-based nuclear deterrent for Russia. And since it is a nuclear component, it is more than a critical infrastructure. It pretty much needs to be hardened and safeguarded, which means that Russia has been layering the region with a lot of an air dome, if you will, and a radar and cyber and electromagnetic warfare dome of protective defense extended towards the North Atlantic as well, extended to Finland and Finnmark, to basically increase this sort of buffer between potential contestation coming from the North Atlantic to the border of the Russian Federation, which is basically pushing the tension away from the bastion, pushing the tension and the conflict away from Russia itself. This is the first thing. The other one is basically rebuilding and revamping force. You mentioned the Arctic Brigade, for instance, which is a quick, rapid reaction force able to move, survive, and operate in a complicated environment. You don't just have to fight little green men, you also have to fight the weather, which means that you also need to revamp the way you see operations in the region. This has been done through the Arctic Brigade, which have been training in Syria, for instance, and unofficially present in Ukraine in terms of acquiring military experience. And this has been done, and this is where it gets really interesting, is in terms of military strategy. Since the 1st of January 2021, Russia has a new military district, officially labeled as such, a full-on and full-fledged new OSK, the OSK Sever, or North, which basically covers the whole Arctic as a continuum, because spoiler alert, Russia doesn't just look at the European Arctic as we do, they look at the Pacific. They look at the Bering Straits, they look at the link with China, they look at the link with North Korea, ballistic missile defense from Japan and Korea, because they see the Arctic as a continuum. It is a strategic pendulum between European and Pacific Arctic with Russia in the middle. And I wouldn't be altogether surprised if, since the Arctic is taking more importance in strategic thinking, we would have a new sort of strategic military exercise specifically tailored to the Arctic in the coming years. We already know about our Vostoks, our Center, our Kafkaz exercises. Well, I'm pretty sure we're going to have a sort of Sever 2023 or Sever 2022 that will basically rehearse the way war should not be taking place against NATO in the Arctic. And I'll stop there.
Maybe I can jump in and build on some of the ideas that Mathieu put forward, because the discussion has also revolved around the reasons behind Russia's military buildup. And this is something that my work also focuses on. So as we have heard, one of the reasons is to protect the second strike capability and the strategic sea-based nuclear assets, which are located around or in the bastion. But there are also other reasons which some of them are not mentioned enough, and some of them are mentioned, but not as primary reasons. So the second one, in addition to the protection of sea-based nuclear assets, is the protection of Russian economic interests. And this is something that Russia mentions quite often, and that is the fact that it considers the Arctic as a strategic resource base. The figures vary, but Russia derives around 20% of its GDP and 30% of its exports from the Arctic. So you know, it's natural gas and oil, fish stocks and minerals. And, you know, by definition, if something is that important to you economically, you would like to safeguard it militarily. And, you know, parallel here could be drawn with the US military presence in the Strait of Hormuz. So another reason why Russia has a building military presence is to protect the economic interests in the region. And the third reason, which I think deserves closer attention, is the way in which military buildup or military presence can help address socio-economic or demographic challenges in the region. As some of you might know, Russia today has the largest Arctic population. I think about 2/3 of all Arctic populations reside within Russian territory. And since 2000, there's been a steady decline in Russian population. And, you know, in many countries, military installations come with federal money and can benefit local communities. In Germany, entire villages depend on US military presence, and this has been visible now that now with the plans that the US bases will relocate. The US Army and Air Force provide a considerable economic boost to places like Fairbanks and Alaska. So this pattern is also visible in Russia, where with military money, you are able to create also civilian positions. You're able to build roads, improve schools, etc., etc. So it's hard to specifically define the link between socioeconomic development of local regions and military investments, but there is one, and it shouldn't be underestimated.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And this reminds me of discussions we were having, Katarina, on the civilian military link in Russia, right, when it comes to the Arctic, and how one fosters the other and how the other one empowers the other. And it's an area of research that is quite interesting.
Yeah, so we have for Mathieu one more question. How do you determine whether a nation is capable of sustaining operation in the Arctic? Are you looking at past operation or theoretical capability? Is China there today? China again. Could such an approach actually encourage non-Arctic nations to get up there to join the group, thereby increasing militarization of the Arctic?
Hi, Snorri. Yeah, that would be the conundrum, right? That you, the more you discuss military stuff, the more you place military, the military on the agenda, and therefore you make it a self-fulfilling prophecy, and you can't really get out of it once you're in it. So in terms of, what is capable of sustaining operations, what is capable of deploying first and then sustaining, which is another thing. I would look at, of course, I would look at the past. I would look at existing even civilian and constabulary capabilities. I mean, look at France, for instance, which would be a good example of how we can deploy in a region without having too much of an overt military presence, or the UK, for instance. What I would be looking into, if we discuss at the level of the alliance and extend it to countries like Finland and Sweden, would be to look at the complementarities in existing military capabilities. Just as, just for the fact that we need to avoid the overlap and to tap into the comparative advantages of certain countries. I mean, this was basically case in line with the UK strategy regarding the Arctic. So the logic in London was that instead of spending billions building stuff we don't need for a region we don't really care so much about, let's play on our comparative advantages and let's look at where we can actually achieve things by synergies and complementarities with our allies. The UK has the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, which could be used as a spearhead to the Arctic, for instance. It has a lot of radar capabilities and listening outposts and intelligence and surveillance because of geography as well and inheritance from the Cold War, and it has a lot of subsurface displacement capabilities. So all in all, you don't really need to revamp your structure, you just need to look at synergies. Is China there today? Well, if you ask Russia, yes, they should be, because they look at what China's been doing in terms of military development, which is basically fielding some potentially armored icebreakers for the PLA, and also developing Arctic capable submarines. And well, polar capable submarines. It could also be around Antarctic waters, but I don't know what they would be doing here, which means that potentially there might be ambition to project. I don't think China should be invited yet in terms of sustaining operations, but once a country has enough capabilities to do so, then yes, they should definitely join the group in a way. But should we encourage non-Arctic nations to get up there? I think it's also a moral obligation that just as much as we want to avoid a weaponization of space and we abide by the treaties in place, we want to avoid a geopoliticization of Antarctica, for instance, we want to keep low tension in the Arctic. So it's a sort of moral code, a moral imperative that cooperation is so much better than the sort of foreshadowing competition that we have at the moment.
Thank you, Mathieu. Thank you. I just received one more question about Russian military posture in the Arctic. Do you guys see any attempt by the Russian political and military leadership to mobilize the Russian public opinion on the Arctic question? And if so, what are the key messages conveyed? In other words, and if so, how the Russian political and military authorities sell the Russian military posture in the Arctic to the Russian public opinion? Thank you.
Maybe I could start. I don't know too much about this subject, but I think that if we look back at the history, since the Soviet Union started exploring the Arctic, it has always figured very highly on the strategic communications agenda. And I think today, and here I'm judging from the Arctic Council experience, it is a very popular endeavor. Arctic chairmanship is publicized and it's very popular with the population. And I think on the whole, there is an interest in, in Russian activities, in seeing what Russia is doing. And I think we will see more of that happening. Russia is the dominant Arctic country by the sheer size of its Arctic territory, by the sheer amount of people living in the Arctic. So it's part of the DNA, I would say. And I think during the Arctic Council chairmanship, we'll see more of that Arctic narrative, Arctic identity being not fed, but really circulating through the media and used to maybe gain more domestic support for other policies.
Yeah, I completely second that. I mean, the Arctic is not presented in terms of big geopolitical divide in the Russian media or in the Russian press. It's mostly about this, cooperation at best when it comes to international affairs, but it's very much that's where the narrative is, right? Russia projects itself as an Arctic civilization. It projects itself as the only hyper North or hyperboreal country because of geography and because of history and because of projection. And plus, as Katarina mentioned, the presence, revamping local access, empowering human development in the region, which it's Russia, so it's never great, right? I mean, the environmental concerns are on paper on top of the agenda. They never really reach the stage where they're actually doing anything about it. Look at the Norilsk spill, for instance. But it's still very much in the narrative an area of cooperation and empowerment for local people, for infrastructure. It's our resource base, quote unquote, with LNG exports. So it's very much an appeased sort of narrative that they're feeding the population. This is unlikely to change, not least because of Russia's chairmanship of the Arctic Council, and therefore the need to showcase good cooperative behavior. And also not least because Russia needs cooperation. They need a stable and predictable Arctic. It is not in Russia's interest to go beyond the accepted red line of military posturing that could endanger this low tension. Yes, it's not perfect. Yes, Russia still has unacceptable military behavior, but we're still far below the level of the Cold War and far below the red lines that we've been crossing in other theaters of operation. So I would still very much keep the logic that it's not presented as a threat or a threat potential by the Russians for the Russians in terms of the chest thumping great power propaganda. It doesn't play out in the Arctic, at least not very well.
If I could add one more thing that came to my mind when Mathieu was speaking, speaking of how to communicate it to the population and how to rally population behind the Arctic cause, one of the, not priorities, but one of the things the upcoming Russian chairmanship will focus on is youth engagement. So it's really going to pay attention to the ways in which it can bring youth into the Arctic discussion. I think this is in line with Russian efforts to make Arctic more attractive, to encourage people to move there, because it's creating job opportunities, it's creating financial incentives. So now there's a special focus on youth and how to get youth interested in Arctic affairs.
So we have a question for you, Mathieu. I did not quite understand the severity of Mathieu's comments concerning the French leaflet on the Arctic, because finally, what I take from the two presentations is that it is indeed Russia that has a strong military posture and footprint in the Arctic. And if we want to avoid this, that the situation is only played between Russia and NATO, we must let the middle powers play a role, mustn't we?
Yeah, I mean, what I wanted to say through this sort of, constructive criticism is the fact that we should not add more fuel to an already pretty dire fire of geopolitical tension around the Arctic and these discussions around hard security in the place of military activity. It's not wise to create these comparisons, because it feeds a sort of collective narrative that yes, now there is tension in the Arctic and that we can no longer deal with it. And it's, the Middle East or the South China Sea, like Pompeo said, are not good comparisons. This is just the message I wanted to, the point I wanted to make. Be careful in your strategy, especially when you're not an Arctic coastal state. I mean, I can see it coming from Canada, from Norway, that who the hell, what the hell are you talking about? You're not an Arctic state. And this is, the Arctic has always been understood in terms of national interest as a club of 5+, the 5+3 or the Arctic 8, above the Arctic Circle or coastal states as an exclusive club. You're Arctic or you're not. You can't be near Arctic. Otherwise, you open the way to China being able to change normative facts on the ground, which is also very dangerous. So we have to strike a balance and come across, clear policy pathways, whether it is through the European Union as a collective whole, or through a French voice, or a Portuguese voice when it comes to fishing, because they're very much interested in fishing in the region, for instance, or you name it. So as a whole, we need to be clearer on what we want to achieve as well. And once again, at the collective level of NATO, play on our collective advantages and our comparative collective advantages when it comes to deploying and operating and being present there. It's not just about Russia-NATO. It should not be about Russia-NATO. It should be about, once again, being as inclusive as possible and making sure we keep that low tension. Middle powers being that as it may, I don't know what is the level of discussion and debate in the French body politic concerning the Arctic, but there's also a lot to be done, once again, around further engagement and further activity to try to foster that spirit and be a voice of reason in the face of mounting geopolitical tension, and not putting, once again, more fuel to the fire.
Okay, the next question is about borders. So maybe Katarina, based on your presentation, you can take this one. You mentioned the Arctic Council. It sounds like borders are mobile and moving, as member states can exert pressure on who can be part of the council and who cannot be part of the council. So can we talk about borders in motion, given that the member states of the Arctic Council have this power of letting other states joining or get out?
Thank you very much. I'm not sure I would say that if borders in motion is the best way to describe this, because we know that the Arctic states, those borders have been already set, and what I've said that the maritime boundaries are the ones where in some cases some overlaps still remain. The Arctic Council, by the way it is structured, it's really this club that is only accessible and where only the Arctic states can make decisions. And then the question is how in the future we could eventually enlarge it to other interested parties. So today we have the Arctic Council members, so the 8 Arctic Council states, but we have observers. Observers don't have a vote, but they can participate in discussions, they can participate in working groups, they can participate in the projects that are carried out under the Arctic Council, under the auspices of the Arctic Council. So In the future, will the Arctic Council membership be enlarged? That remains to be seen. I think that's hard to answer, but when thinking about the powers of the Arctic Council, we should remember that it's really more of a round table. It's not a lawmaking body. It doesn't have any compliance mechanism. It works by consensus. So there isn't just one party who can speak on behalf of the Council. It's a consensus decision shaping body. So there are many limitations to what the Arctic Council can do. But the future of Arctic regime as a whole, I think it might need to be rethought in 10, 20 years down the line. But it won't mean that the boundaries will be rethought. It's the regime that might be rethought. Mathieu, would you have anything to add to
No,
that?
no. It's nothing to add. It's a great answer.
I'd like to elaborate a little bit on that. How about the effects of climate change on the borders of the Arctic? Because fish are, you know, going to move and going to go to probably colder waters, right? So then actors are going to want to, you know, go and fish there, and it's going to be, I mean, the whole territorial scene is going to be changing because of climate change. Is this going to impact border regime or different actions by the various actors that you guys both mentioned?
Do you want to start?
Sure, yeah, very quickly, absolutely. And it's a key question for the coming 40 to 50 years. Fish will move north to colder waters, and there are already projections of cod and haddock and halibut stocks and the way they will move north as the climate change impacts the region. And if fish moves north, then fishermen will move north as well, which will also impact the way that deployments in terms of the fleet of civilian fishing vessels and the trawlers there will be able to operate, and will probably also be of the appetite of other states with a lot of fishing experience who will deploy such capabilities to operate in deep Arctic waters. And this will, of course, change normative facts and will require adaptations. China will be out there for fish as well, and we know they're fish and fish protein hungry, and will also go where the fish goes. And this is also a big part and a big component of China's Arctic and polar strategy in general. So I don't have the legal specifics, but yes, absolutely, this is definitely something to look into in terms of changing borders and boundary issues when it comes to these waters.
Excellent answer. And if I can elaborate on that, as I've mentioned in my presentation, fish stock, the existing ones before they migrate northward, are within the economic zones of Arctic states. But foreseeing that will happen, and if you remember my slide about the 5 treaties, legally binding treaties that have been established, one of them is the Treaty for the Central Arctic Ocean from 2018, which was signed by 5 Arctic littoral states and Japan, China, South Korea, Iceland, and the EU. And it basically bans unregulated fishing in the Central Arctic Ocean for 16 years. So all these countries, so 10 countries came together, signed a legally binding agreement that for 16 years, so for 14 more, they will not do fishing in the Central Arctic Ocean, and once, in 14 years, we might come to a different agreement on how we will regulate that fishing, but we're not there yet.
So thank you. We have one more question about the European Union and the Arctic. What is the main political agenda of the EU in the Arctic, and how did it last update in 2013 change from the agenda set in 2008? What could be the new strategies for the next decade? Russia, for instance, published its new agenda in December 2020 for the years 2020-2035, and set the main focus on the global climate change and the demographic question in the Arctic. So what could be the new strategies for the European Union?
Maybe I will start. So it is hard for me to say what will be part of the Arctic policy, because it's Arctic policy that's in the making. There has been a public consultation. I think it closed in November, where the EU invited opinions from various stakeholders, not only from the EU, who want to have a say in what this policy should look like. So it's still in the making. And here I just want to mention, because you compare the EU to Russia, but in fact, the EU is composed of different member states. And I think there are several of those member states who have their own Arctic strategy. So first of all, the EU is currently not an observer to the Arctic Council, but it has member states who are. So I think 6 or 7 EU member states are also observers to the Arctic Council. There are more EU member states who have their own Arctic strategies, their own priorities, their own roadmaps for how they want to engage with the region. So maybe you should be comparing Russian strategy with individual member state strategies. And I think that this updated EU policy, and maybe I can speak a little bit more about how I see, or where I would place it, and why should the EU care. So first of all, the EU is dependent on the Arctic for hydrocarbons, for fish, and also it recognizes that as the 3rd largest polluter globally, it is partly responsible for what is happening in the Arctic. So I think there is this consideration that EU has a responsibility to do something about the situation in the Arctic. And I lost my line of thought. So, excuse me. so it recognizes it has the responsibility, and in this context, I got it. It also considers itself to be a climate leader, and especially since the Trump administration withdrew from the Paris Agreement and the global climate regime, the EU stepped in to fill in the void. So the Arctic policy should be really understood within the context of the EU's global climate efforts. So it's just part of those efforts. And it remains to be seen what will be part of it. It will not focus on hard security. There's the EU strategic compass, which will be coming out, which might have some security consideration, but really the policy there will be a continuity in terms of focus on sustainable development, livelihood opportunities, environment, because we also have to remember that 3 EU member states are also Arctic states. So the EU can legislate in 3 EU Arctic countries. So the European Green Deal is applicable in 3 Arctic states. The European policy will be applicable in 3 Arctic states. And, maybe the EU wants to be a normative power, and hoping that the policies it adopts and the laws it adopts will have a positive normative influence on the Arctic as a whole.
Mathieu, do you want to weigh in, or?
No, not much to add. I fully agree with what Katarina said. What I would like to see from the future Arctic, European strategies is this streamlining between the European interest and that of its Arctic nations and beyond. As Katarina was saying, there is now this, there is this opportunity for the EU to legislate into the body politic of Arctic nations, which means that there's a lot of dissension, there's a lot of tension when it comes to addressing what the Arctic is about, which means that the EU policy through their, it's actually 2016, not 2013, the last document, the integrated EU policy, has, very, very broad actions. There's like 40 or something actions that need to be taken around these pillars of environmental protection and climate change, sustainable development and use of resources and international cooperation. But they are very broad, and they're broad enough that they don't really create a problem for anyone. But if the European Union, wants to be a more insightful and a more active player, they also need to have a proper European way and a proper European voice in this that actually uses its comparative advantages of being a broader multinational institution and representative also of Arctic nations and Arctic coastal nations. So it's a very fine line to find, but I hope to see more of this in the years to come for the EU, definitely.
Thank you. So we are switching from Europe back to Asia. And a question about Japan and South Korea have recently joined the race in the Arctic through the elaboration of their own Arctic policies, mainly for economic and energetic purposes, Arctic route and LNG investments. How do you see the opening of the Arctic Club to further Asian countries, especially to US allies, in terms of balance within the Arctic Council in the light of US/China strategic competition? Large question, thank you very much, and good luck.
So nobody wants to start first, right? Okay, I can jump on. It's a really good question. The why is simple. It's basically putting now the terms of the deal when we actually need to act on this race for the Central Arctic Ocean. I see it more as a way for these countries to pre-position themselves in terms of a potential Arctic passage in the Central Arctic Ocean and not being on the losing edge of things, especially because China is moving out there. And there's a reason why it's Japan and South Korea who have actually presented sort of strategic documents and papers concerning specifically the Arctic. It's not Vietnam, it's not the Philippines, it's not, it's basically the contested nations against China, the contesting nations, sorry, against China, who also do not want to be left behind and do not want to jump on the bandwagon last minute because they need to be there as well. So it is very much along economic and energy purposes. It is very much about investment, empowerment, all the soft power rhetoric that we know and love. But it's very much about placing facts on the ground now, so that when they need to act and they need to do things, the proper way, then they will have leverage and they will have presence already. Concerning the Arctic Club, well, it's same as above, right? It's the question of Arctic coastal states and the very small club of Arctic 8 allowing or not for these joint and common narratives of what the Arctic should be about. If the weight and the shift of, the balance goes and shifts towards global commons as an understanding of what Arctic governance should be about, then yes, there will be, everybody will be part of the club. If it is still tightly, tucked around national interests, then it will still be a question of Arctic Council members with observers, with countries with more clout and more leverage, you name it, but still very much about protecting the national interest in the region. So I don't think we're there yet. I think it's a question for the longer term, but it's a question that will keep evolving as climate change impacts the whole region and as human activities are increasing in the region, and military activities, of course.
I don't have much to add because this also goes back to the earlier discussion we had, about the internationalization of Arctic affairs. But I just want to recall that both Japan and South Korea are Arctic Council observers, and the general approach. So they are already part of the structure. They have shown that they have interest in participating in projects and in things that have to do with the Arctic. And the general approach up to date was, as Joe and I would say, integrate but hedge. So they are integrated, but their powers are limited. And so going back to what I said earlier, looking into the future, we have to see how this balance between Arctic states by territory and non-Arctic states who will have a significant economic input into the region, into the development of the region, how that will play out. And also, I know that it also depends on where countries like Russia seek their investment. It's not coming from the West, but it's coming from Asia. So I think it also depends on being invited to participate in those projects, because there's also an inviting side. And for as long as that is the case, we can see more Asian investment coming into the region.
The logic is that you're denied until you're allowed. And when you don't make the rules, you got to abide by them. That's the Arctic creed.
Yeah, so we have one other question about sanctions. and about the extent to which Western sanctions have hampered Russian development of the Arctic, and has further pushed together Russia and China into the Arctic development.
Do you want to go first, Katarina? Or?
All right. Okay. If there was an invitation, yes. So as I have mentioned, I think that, you know,
division of labor.
So I think what happened in 2014 was that, you know, the Western sanctions really dried up the capital and technology pools for Russian energy projects in the Arctic, and then, you know, China was ready to step in. So I think that's when we saw the development of economic ties deepening, and it is directly related to what happened in 2014. So yes, so I see their connection between the sanctions and the current state of Russia, Sino-Russian commercial ties.
I fully agree. The caveat for Russia is that generally investments in the Arctic are on China's terms. They're under Russian rule, but they're on China's terms, which means that China's been investing a lot of time and effort in LNG facilities because they need the gas. But for the rest, all these grandiose talks about assistance for infrastructure, assistance to human development in the region with Russia, it's just not materializing because China has zero incentive to do it and they have zero return on investment. So they're resource hungry, so they go get the gas, which leaves Russia in a state of dependency because doing so, they're not really deploying and restructuring the Northern Sea routes as they see fit. And it is very much on China's terms. Sanctions have definitely pushed, well, Russia pushed itself away from the West, not that sanctions pushed Russia away from us, but basically it's hampering Russia's ability to have access to investment for energy infrastructure, and God knows they need the money, and technology. Basic drilling capabilities in deep water or to access shale oil or compound oil and gas in Arctic waters. And these they do not have. And these they can't really find in China because they're not up to speed technologically to be able to achieve that much in terms of drilling. The other component is price, because it's a price-driven market through demand. Prices is down. There's an LNG gas. We have too much gas that we need to burn. Therefore, the Russian old sort of brownfields in oil are becoming unnecessary, and the new greenfield and brownfield investments in gas are not really making a lot of money because we have too much gas in the market. So the sort of resource base of the 21st century that Russia was venting about a few years ago is just not materializing. So once again, it's on China's terms. Russia has, you know, no other choice to comply, and they push themselves away from the West. I mean, sanctions are not responsible for driving Russia to China. Russia is responsible for driving itself towards China through its actions.
I agree with Mathieu. And if I can add one more thing, is that in the recent Russian strategic documents, Russia also stresses the mutually beneficial relationships. So for as long as the one with China is mutually beneficial, China will remain a stakeholder. But if there are other partners who can provide such mutual benefits or who can provide either investment or technology, you know, we can see Russia shifting its attention elsewhere.
We have now a question about non-state actors. Can you touch upon the actors, basically who is defending the indigenous population's interests in terms of wildlife management, education, economic development, sustainable development, climate change? Who are the non-state actors in the Arctic?
I'm afraid I won't be able to answer because that goes beyond my expertise, but perhaps Matthew can start, and I can.
No, yeah, no, it goes way beyond my remit. I agree. So this is where the political scientists, you know, disappear. But I'll try to do the Sciences Po method. I'll try to talk for 2 minutes, saying semi-interesting things about the topic. No, the non-state actors are actually need to be more empowered in the region. If you look at the indigenous populations, advocacy groups, for instance, these people are the prime, you know, they have local knowledge, they live in the region, and they are the first impacted by the climate change and increased human activity. So they should be basically the first to create this policy of what it is that the Arctic is becoming and how we should be addressing these changes. The problem is that they're not necessarily as present as they ought to be. They have representation in the Arctic Council and in the governance bodies around the Arctic. It's a bit more complicated in Russia because there's a love-hate relationship between the state and RAIPON, for instance, one of the main advocacy group for indigenous populations. But there is still a bigger role to play for indigenous people and non-state representatives in this region. The other non-state actor is big oil companies, very much present in terms of advocacy, lobbying, and exploitation of the region, but I will just stop there. And other players are the wildlife protection. WWF, for instance, is super active in the Arctic when it comes to wildlife protection and mitigating the impact of climate change and environmental catastrophes and damage to the region. So they're also represented, I believe, in the Arctic Council. And there's the Arctic Council has the beauty of being a non-binding cooperative framework that actually has everybody in it, everybody that matters: indigenous populations, representatives of civil society, of wildlife protection institutions, and so on. So it's a very full and comprehensive body. The problem is that the agenda setting is really complicated. As you can imagine, there's a lot to discuss, there's very little time, and we tend to go where we know best, which is the Pompeo statement of 2019 about strategic competition, because this is also a human knee-jerk reaction to what we see elsewhere. So more empowerment for local populations, less geopolitical matters. I think that would be a good way forward for the Arctic.
Mathieu, that was excellent. Sciences Po 2 minutes strategy. Just
should I make a disclaimer about Sciences Po right now? Because I know there's a lot of issues.
I only have a few small things that I would like to add. So I completely agree with what has been raised, that, that they have a voice within the Arctic Council. And I think this is what makes the Arctic Council as a regional body very unique, because there's no other organization that gives a seat to the table to indigenous communities. And in the end of the day, all these indigenous communities, they're not just floating around, they're citizens of Arctic states. So their states and their governments are the ones who should be providing for their interests and have their interests at heart. And that varies from one country to another. So Canada has a completely different relationship with its indigenous populations than does Russia. So I think here it would be interesting to look at it comparatively. But of course, these populations are across borders, and we should be protecting the Arctic Council as a regime because it is unique in giving them a voice and a seat at the table.
So I have one question. Actually, it's my question now to both of you guys. So you recently wrote a very interesting piece for the Wilson Center about civil military role happening in Russia over the development and management of the Arctic. Could you guys just elaborate a little bit more on that topic and maybe give us some clue on, according to both of you, finally now, who got the upper end in the making of the Russia's Arctic strategy, the civilian energetic sector, or the Russian, let's say, hard military community?
I'm happy to let Mathieu start because he was the lead author on the publication.
It was a joint effort. It was a forehand effort. But sure, yeah, let me jump on it. So it's a compound question. I'll just start with this new Russian strategy that was floated out a few months ago in March, right? There's basic principles of Russian Federation policy, or whatever it's called, until 2035, which is basically the last two phases of the previous strategy that was supposed to end in 2020, but they got 15 years late, basically, in doing. So they're playing catch up and extending it another 15 years to make sure they can actually implement with 15 years delay. So what this document is really about is all of the above when it comes to environmental protection, development of infrastructure, empowerment of local populations, human development, energy exploitation, international cooperation, you name it. All the blah blah that Russia loves when it comes to playing the cooperation card. But it also outlines for the first time external challenges, quote unquote, things that actually are a problem to Russia's understanding of sovereignty and territorial integrity in the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation. They talk about normative challenges, for instance, with several states trying to undermine the Northern Sea routes. They're talking about economic challenges with states trying to deny Russia economic activity. I'm talking to you, Norway, for instance, when it comes to Svalbard fishing. Legal challenges when it comes to countries trying to discredit Russia, blah, blah, blah. So it's all about Russia venting about the fact that there is an encroachment to Russia's sovereignty. And they talk about military challenges. All in all, it is a very securitized understanding of the Arctic. You have basically a schizophrenic approach to the Arctic. You have what you feed the Russian population in the international arena, which is very much civilian, along the lines of all of the above. And there is what happens in the shadows in the Kremlin corridors, which is the more militarized / lobbying function aspect. And this is where you have this conflation of civilian and military issues, and this conflation of basically corrupt vested interest in acquiring more clout, more influence, and more leverage in Arctic policy. Since the Arctic was rediscovered as a new thing on the Russian foreign internal policy agenda, it became quickly understood as a new cake to share. And if there's a cake to share, there's money to be made, which means that you had a flurry of actors, civilian and military, coming to get money out of it, because there is extortion to be made out of Arctic policy. There is a lot of money there, and therefore you're feeding basically the Russian system. What you have now is the sort of conflation of interest between the military lobby and the nuclear powered lobby, those in charge of passage along the Northern Sea route, basically Rosatom and its fleets, Rosatom Flot, and the military lobby. They basically vie and compete for pretty much the same lines of budgets when it comes to pure hardware, because the army on one side and then the FSB with the Coast Guard and the Border Guard on the other hand have the same line of budget when it comes to capabilities and deployment of constabulary forces. So they compete in the same pool of money. Rosatom has been courting the FSB to try to deny the army more leverage in procurement and budget. And the army has been pushing back by amplifying the Arctic threats. If you see a lot of things coming from Russia concerning the Arctic threat, it's pretty much a lobbying function for the army to show that we need to justify the budget and we need more stuff. On the other hand, Rosatom has been lobbying very hard in the body politic of Russia to make sure the Northern Sea route is safely tucked and safeguarded into a very administrative package that is under basically the rules of Rosatom. The people in charge of the Arctic Commission in Russia pretty much operating under Rosatom's order, or people close to the nuclear establishment. This is pretty much established. So internally, it is very much a lobbying function. And there is not really such thing as a civilian military link. There's mostly where you place your bets and where you place your money and your vested interest when it comes to getting a bit of the pie in this new Arctic cake.
I think Mathieu summarized that perfectly well. And one other aspect of our article was that what we're seeing increasingly in the Arctic is the deployment of dual-use technologies, that are serving both civilian and military purposes, but it also makes it difficult to distinguish what the intentions are behind some of them. So I think that's the only thing I would add.
Thank you.
I think that's it for the Arctic questions. We don't have any more questions, and we're hitting 7 p.m. Paris time. So I think we can conclude and thank our two speakers. This was absolutely fascinating. I think everybody agrees it was a success. We had very interesting questions. So thank you again to both of you for sticking to the format and for being willing to participate and for your answers. We just want to announce the next session, which will be taking place at the same time. So 5 to 7 p.m. Paris time on February 24th. So that is going to be in 2 weeks from today. And we'll be tackling the new regional dynamics after the ceasefire agreement in Nagorno-Karabakh. So stay tuned. Yeah, just be there. And thank you again to the audience.
Yeah.
Katarina and Mathieu, the audience and the questions.
Thank you very much for having us.
For staying with us. All right.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe, everyone. Cheers.
Take care. Bye.
Stay safe.
Thank you.